We are on air. It's 1925. This is Moscow Urban Forum, right from the center of the capital in Manezh. We are on track to this happy town. My name is Ksenia Chudinova, chief editor of Snow Project, and today's headliner is Charles Montgomery and his stellar lecture about happy towns. I would like to say a few more words about Charles Montgomery. He's an amazing author. Unfortunately, he wrote just 2 books, but both were awarded with glory and fame. Most importantly, Charles Montgomery regularly reissues his articles. He's not only an urbanist, but also a geographist. He's a journalist, photo editor, and he's mostly famed for the book that was about his great-grandfather, Mr. Montgomery, that was one of episcopes in Tasmania. In 2013, Charles Montgomery wrote a book, Happy Cities, and it was published in Russia in 2019 by Man Ivanov and Ferber Publishing Agency, and about how to make cities happy. What is it? Is it a magic or is it a real art? And this is what Charles Montgomery will be talking about today. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Добрый вечер. It is such a pleasure to speak to you, my friends in Russia and across Europe and around the world today. I know these are dark and difficult times, but the pandemic has been challenging for people around the world, and I would like to bring you a message of hope. And that is this: if we follow our hearts, but also the evidence that links urban design and urban planning and an urban policy to human well-being, we can create cities that are happier, healthier, and more inclusive for everyone. And it's a bright future. So I would like to share with you some science and some stories today, but I want to begin with a question for you to ponder. And that's this: I'm curious if you can think about which street edge is a happier place. Is it this edge, which is a little bit dirty, a little bit messy, a little bit chaotic, with some small shops, services, openings, a little bar? Or is it this street edge, which is clean, which is modern, which has a glass wall looking in at a health food store along the way? So ponder that. Which of these 2 street edges on the same street in New York City is a happier place? Now, that question, which place is happier, matters much more than most people think. And before giving you an answer to that question, I want to set the stage for what we'll be speaking about today. So I've spent the last 15 years examining the relationship between urban design, city spaces, architecture, city systems, and what we've come to call the science of happiness or the science of well-being. And this work has convinced me that the places we create, the communities, neighborhoods, buildings, and cities, they change the way we feel, they change the way we move, and they change the way we treat other people in ways that most of us don't even imagine. So we now have the evidence to link urban design to human well-being. And this means we have a responsibility, whether you're a politician, an urban planner, an engineer, an architect, a mobility specialist, a property developer. We have the responsibility to undo some of the damage our cities have done over the last 100 years, and to create new places that fill people with joy and wonder and possibility. So that's where I want to take you today. But I think anytime we're talking about happy cities, we need to start with the question, well, what do we mean by happiness? Well, it's a question that we've been debating for a couple of thousand years, ever since Aristotle stood out in the Agora in ancient Athens and spoke about eudaimonia, our human well-being. Well, fortunately, over the past couple of decades, we can go beyond speculation because scientists are finding evidence for that link between well-being and our physical presence in the human body. So, for example, people who say they are happier, they have more activity in the pleasure centers of their brains. They have lower levels of stress hormones coursing through their bodies. So my colleagues and I think it makes a lot of sense to take our cues and our lessons from science and apply them to the world around us and the places we create. So we're drawing from psychology, from neuroscience, from behavioral economics, from public health, and from other disciplines, including architecture and urban planning, when these disciplines actually study the results of the places they create or change. And we have created what we feel is a very robust recipe for urban well-being and how to design urban well-being. And you'll be glad to know I'm not going to take you through the entire recipe today. There's a book for that. You can read it. It's very good. My mother would be very happy if you bought it for Christmas. Instead, I want to focus on the element of urban well-being that matters more than anything else. What matters most to urban well-being? Well, I think most of us who have been enduring the isolation and the disconnection of the coronavirus pandemic would not be surprised to learn that it's human connection. It's our relationship with other people. We'll do anything to be together with those we love. And in fact, people who are socially connected to family and to friends, they get sick less often, they're more productive at work, they're more likely to survive cancer, their communities are happier, and they live on average 15 years longer than people who are socially disconnected. And you might think, well, of course, family and friends are very important to my happiness. But this goes beyond your family and friends. Studies are now showing that our relationship with everybody else in the city also matters. How much can you trust your neighbors? How much can you trust strangers? These are very important questions, and they play out in studies of happiness across cities and nations. For example, looking at my own country, Canada, there's a strong relationship between people's self-reported life satisfaction and how much they say they can trust their neighbors. So if you don't know Canada, what you're seeing on this graph is that Canada's big, rich cities are losing on happiness. Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, losers. Who's winning? A humble, small town, not very wealthy on the east coast of Canada called St. John's. Now, many of my friends, my hippie friends here in Vancouver say, see, money doesn't matter for happiness. Well, they're wrong. Money really does matter. What this graph is showing you is that the social effect overwhelms the financial effect. Social relationships are that important. Now, if all you care about is economic wealth, well, I have a message for you as well. There's an extremely strong correlation between trusting, levels of trust in your country and economic performance. Trusting cities, trusting countries do better. Now, I have some concerning news about Russia. In the World Happiness Report in 2020, Russia scored 73rd amongst nations on happiness. Now, what this chart is telling us is when they break down the surveys and compare them to other questions being asked about the economy and about relationships, we see that Russia's low level of self-reported happiness, the biggest explainer is something called social support. Put quite simply, Russians are much less likely than, for example, Danes or even Mexicans to report that they have people to count on, that they have good relationships with neighbors, friends, and even strangers. And so this is something that's essential for Russians to work on, and this is something we can work on through our work in urban design and planning. So I want to start at the building level, and then as I go through my presentation, I will build up to the level of the neighborhood and then this urban system. But let's start with the building. Let's start with home. As I mentioned, I'm from Canada. This is my city, Vancouver. Now, Vancouver's core, which I believe Larry Beasley spoke about earlier in this forum, is a very beautiful, high status place of tall residential towers. Well, unfortunately, surveys are reporting that the people who live in our tower neighborhoods are less happy and have worse relationships than people who live closer to the ground. We investigated this. We've been interviewing people who live in various urban environments. For example, this building, which is a tower of the Vancouverist typology that Larry Beasley spoke about earlier. So a tall, thin tower, so everybody gets a view along a podium base with shops and services. On this tower, for example, though, on the third story of the building is a recreational area. So you see a volleyball court and gardens. And facing this recreational area, you see about 12 townhouses who all have entrances facing the garden. So you have a tower with about 300 units and then 12 units of townhouses. Now, what we found is people who live up in that tower, they're reporting feeling disconnected. They don't know their neighbors. They have less trust in their neighbors. But people who are living on this townhouse level, on the third floor podium, they're expressing high levels of trust. And what's really interesting is they use this outdoor space. They're using the volleyball court. They're having cocktail parties. They seem to be having a great time. So what's interesting is in one of the people we interviewed, this man's name is Rob. He moved to the tower when it first opened. And he found he was very lonely there. So he eventually moved down to one of the townhouses at the base. And within weeks, he knew all the names of his neighbors. Within months, he was babysitting their children, taking care of their children. Now, all these people go on vacations together. Rob told me when I said, would you say you love your neighbors? And he said, love like family? And I said, yes. And he said, I would say I love 7 of my neighbors. Now, when you consider the average American says they can only trust 1.5 people on the whole planet, this is remarkable. This shift from the tower to this more clustered social environment. This really got my team and I thinking, what explains the difference in happiness, but mostly the difference in social relations in these two places? Well, we spent a lot of money and many months working to pull together the evidence on social well-being and multi-family housing to explain these relationships between design and well-being and relationships. And I'll give you 2 pieces of evidence we found. Why was the townhouse level more social and more socially connected? So, number 1, the townhouse level had these soft entrances where you could connect with your neighbors without inviting them inside. And as it turns out, that's exactly what we need to begin the relationships of friendship, is these soft opportunities. That being compared to being stuck in an elevator with one of, say, 300 people you don't know so well, it's obvious which one leads to people reaching out to each other. There's also the question of social scale. So from evolutionary anthropology, we're learning that people historically have tended to gather in smaller groups. And in fact, every time we meet a new person, we have to decide whether to remember their name or not. It's a lot of work for our brains. Often, if you're confronted with hundreds of people every day, you consider them to be strangers, not worth getting to know. But if the social cluster is, say, 10, 15, 20 people, we begin to reach out, we begin to remember each other and care for one another. So those are 2 pieces of evidence. We've taken the entirety of our body of evidence on social well-being and built form and pour them into one, what we call a happy, connected home. This is Tomo House, which stands for Together More, where all the evidence has come together. So a few of the things that Tomo House is doing to create social relationships. Number one, only 12 families under one roof. Number two, extensive social spaces within the building, including the courtyard you see at the back. Number three, soft circulation so that people can see their neighbors and bump into their neighbors without necessarily inviting them inside for dinner yet. That comes later. And the innovations go on. What I'm saying is we can design places that maximize strong, positive social relationships. Okay, so let's think about the Russian context. We know that you have millions of units of these, I think they're called Khrushchevsky, the old mid-century housing that was built. We know it is decrepit, it's falling apart. In some cases, you're tearing it down and replacing it with towers where everybody enjoys views. How would those towers be performing socially? Well, let's look a little bit closer. We see environments where, again, people are faced with hundreds of people, hundreds of neighbors in their elevators, so they're pushed together. But look at the base of these buildings. There is no intermediate social space. There are no smaller gathering spaces. And so when you walk out your front door, this is your front yard. You are sharing a public space with thousands and thousands of other people. We've learned from our work that this causes people to recede from one another. So we would be very concerned that you may not be happier in these environments. And in fact, people who live in residential towers are the most likely to report feeling crowded and lonely at the very same time. It doesn't need to be that way, but it's often the case. Where do the children play in these new environments? We see developers are creating plenty of places for cars to play and cars to sleep. But what about the children? We've been very impressed in our research by the work of Studio Strelka in Moscow to take the old Khrushchevsky housing and say, what can you do with these spaces to make them livable, to update them? And Studio Strelka, I've stolen one of their images from their website, has done this powerful work looking at renovating and rejuvenating the Khrushchevsky housing so that, first of all, you give people private space and balconies, because private space is so important. You renovate and make the buildings stronger. You create smaller social spaces on the roofs of these buildings. You activate the bases of the buildings with bigger spaces for shops and services and social gatherings. And it goes on. There's one more piece. They suggest reintroducing a street grid so you can have smaller, slower streets, and then adding more small buildings to activate spaces that were once too big or alienating. Strelka, through their research, insists that this can provide more housing at 30% lower costs than demolishing these neighborhoods and building towers. So it's something we think is worth considering. And it's, of course, happening elsewhere. We see in Eastern Germany, they're performing these renovations. Okay, I want to talk about public space now. My team and I, we love to play around and conduct experiments in public space. One experiment was this. We worked with the Guggenheim Museum in New York City on an urban laboratory, and they invited us to create experiments. So I pulled in our neuroscientist partners from the University of Waterloo, and we looked at the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We created a tour to find out which public spaces made people feel happy and excited or not. Now, we used this incredible Canadian invention known as the BlackBerry. If any of you listening are very old, you may remember the BlackBerry. I think it's dead now, but we used the BlackBerry so people could punch in their feelings. I feel happy, I feel sad, I feel excited, I feel calm. We also used these wrist cuffs to measure how excited people were in any moment. We learned many things, but one thing we learned is this. Remember those two street edges I mentioned to you at the beginning of this presentation. We've got the messy street edge on the left and the clean street edge on the right. Well, as it turns out, you can consider which ones you thought were going to be the happiest. And I'll tell you, the hundreds of people who joined our tours found that the street edge on the left, the messy street edge, made them much happier. They felt happier standing here and relaxing here. Why is that? It's messy, it's dirty, it's chaotic. Well, it turns out that people slow down in environments like this. There are more reasons to stop. And we find that people are actually happier when they move more slowly and when they're engaging with things and other people. In the environment on the right, in the clean environment, people walk more quickly. And we also know from research in Canada that older adults get older more quickly and die sooner in those environments because there are fewer places for them to walk to. So, okay, happiness is a feeling. People feel happier in these messy, slow spaces. But what about their behavior? Does the environment change their behavior? We followed up on this experiment in Seattle, where we surveyed urban landscapes looking for, on the one hand, active or slow edges with lots of things going on, maybe messy, and on the other hand, fast edges, blank edges where nothing was going on. And then we sent our volunteers out to pretend that they were lost tourists. So here's one of our lost tourists looking at her map, pretending to be completely lost, and then waiting to see if anybody will come and help her. So in these two kinds of environments, how did strangers treat our lost tourists? In the active environment on the left and the blank environment on the right, they produced remarkably different social actions. Along the active, slow environment, with lots of small shops and services, pedestrians were 4 times as likely to stop and offer to help. When she said, oh, could you just lend me your phone? They were absolutely more likely to lend their phone. And then when our helpless lost tourist said, geez, can you please just take me where I need to go? I'm completely lost. You've got to take me there. Again, they were 4 times as likely to take her where she needed to go. And that particular volunteer actually managed to get a date out of this experience. They're probably married now, but this is very bad research methodology. So we did scold her afterwards. But the point is, these environments don't just change how we feel. They change how we behave. So this means that Happiness Street in Dubai is a disaster because they've killed the edge of the street, whereas the old neighborhoods in Dubai are still active and friendly and welcoming. In Poland, you see the difference between the dead edge and the active edge that can change our behavior and our feelings. Okay, I want to be moving beyond the street edge now to be thinking about streets and mobility spaces and other public spaces, going a bit beyond this. And indeed, we've concluded that how we move changes how we feel. So surveys around the world are showing that people who walk or bike in their commute, they feel much more joy and much lower fear, rage, and sadness than people moving in by any other means. So this is an exciting thing to learn. If we want to be happier, we just need to walk more and we need to bike more. Well, if you look at Moscow itself, only 3% of the people are walking, 3% biking. So only 6% of the people are commuting in the way that is actually the fastest route to happiness. Almost nobody is moving that way. So what's going on? Well, we do know that in a city like Moscow, you've moved so many residential neighborhoods away from the city heart, and you haven't mixed uses in those neighborhoods so that people are not able to work close to home. They're not able to walk to work. So that's an issue with the central plan. And I believe many of you are thinking about changing that and adding a more mix of uses and moving jobs and home closer together. But there's something else going on. Could there be something about the way you have historically designed your streets and public spaces that could be deterring people from walking. I did a little Google tour of Moscow this past weekend. I got a little bit scared in these spaces, and I want to be clear why I'm using that word scared. I felt scared looking at this street. Why did I feel scared? Well, my emotion was natural. Going back to our investigation of New York City, where we fitted people with skin conductance monitors that measured their level of arousal or excitement in the moment, their physical excitement in the moment. We looked at our neuroscientist friend, Dr. Ellard, looked at how do people feel when they're crossing this particular street you're viewing. This is East Houston Street. How do they feel? How do their bodies react? Well, here's what we saw in his results when people were about to cross the street. Now, notice the two mountains. There's a mountain on the left side, a smaller mountain, and then a big mountain when they cross. These are mountains of arousal. If you combine arousal with negative affect or low happiness, that's called stress. It's horrible. And what I want you to see here is that people started feeling highly aroused while they were standing on the sidewalk, just thinking about crossing the street. They became scared. And then, of course, the arousal went up as they crossed the street. What this means, though, is that someone like this woman needs to be extremely brave to consider crossing a busy street because she'll begin to feel fear even before she makes the crossing, which means the other half of the neighborhood may not be available to her. And she's scared for a very good reason, of course. We know that something like enough people die in traffic accidents to fill up 39 jumbo jets in Russia every year. The number's coming down a little bit every year, but it's still important to note that your streets are 7 times as dangerous as German streets. How can you slow them down? Here's where, despite the horrors of the global pandemic we're experiencing, and they are horrors, and we're experiencing pain together, and that should never be diminished. I could think of one good thing that may come out of our experience this past year, and that is this, is that cities around the world are reconsidering how streets are used. Cities around the world are reconsidering what a safe street looks like. How can we slow streets down now that more and more people want to be on the street to socialize or to move? So we're slowing streets down. We're also realizing as people move to more cycling in cities, which isn't necessarily true, but it feels safer than public transport. We're making spaces that are safer for cyclists to move through. Cities such as Auckland in New Zealand, the national government in New Zealand is paying 90% of the cost to make these changes permanent. They want the streets to be for people again, not just for cars. This will save lives over the long term, but it will create a new social life in the city. Now, I know that some of this work has already begun in Moscow. With your renovation of the garden ring and pedestrianization of some of those spaces. I applaud you for this. I also know how incredibly expensive it is to do these high status projects when most people are living in places outside the core, and they're still waiting for that work to happen. And I think we can take inspiration from places like Mexico City, where they found low-cost ways to identify excess road space that might be reclaimed and given to pedestrians in a very low-cost way. And they do it using cones and paint. And these places become reclaimed. They become social spaces, but they also become more equitable spaces where it's easier for everybody to move. Now, you might say, well, this is Russia, it's not Mexico, right? We have a lot of snow here. So I invite you to take some inspiration from this fellow. No, he's not dead. No, he was not hit by a car. This is a fellow in a northern Canadian city who loves to lie down on the snow and streets to demonstrate that wherever you see excess snow sitting on the street in winter, that means cars just generally aren't using that space. What that means is we can reclaim that space from cars to create pedestrian spaces. This is a movement that's occurring in northern cities around the world. And here you can see where in the USA, snow space is identified in one winter and then reclaimed into permanent pedestrian, safe, and social space the next summer. So this can happen. Okay, one last story I want to share with you. And it's something that's important to say because often when we were speaking about the message of happier cities, more inclusive cities, the response we get is, well, isn't happiness just icing on the cake? I mean, first we need to make money, don't we, to pay for all these things. I want to assure you that everything you would do to make a happier, healthier place is also good for business. And I'll give you one example of this. So we were approached by British Land, which is the biggest property developer and owner in the United Kingdom. British Land controls, amongst other spaces, Paddington Central, which is just north of Paddington Station. So British Land are global leaders on sustainability, but they wanted to become leaders on well-being. And so how could they do this? So first of all, we worked with British Land's teams to look at the spaces they've created and then identify their own values for happiness and compare that to the evidence. And then we would begin to audit these places using clear happiness principles. How, for example, could Paddington Central be renovated to increase feelings of joy, social connection, good health, feelings of belonging, and feelings of equity, to create places where everybody felt they were welcome. And then we audit the place and come up with changes. Now, here is Kingdom Road in the heart of Paddington Central. If you ever go through London, just walk north of Paddington Station and you'll find it, but it doesn't look like this anymore. This is how it used to look: cold, corporate, hard surfaces, unwelcoming. Once we apply the happiness audit and change this place to specifically boost feelings of well-being, this is what they came up with: a place that is softer, that is greener, infused with nature, that is more playful, that is more welcoming. A remarkable thing that happened in this work was this: once we created this softer, more welcoming place, there was a 50% jump in women using the space. So this space didn't just become prettier and softer, it became a place that was more inclusive. Our cities too often are planned for men, by men. And we have got to start changing that work so that they're inclusive of everyone. Now, it's important to note who led this work at British Land, who pushed the hardest for it. I will tell you, it was the lease managers, the people who need to lease out the office buildings and the residences. Why? Because they knew that the happier place was easier to rent and lease rates would be higher. And that's exactly been the result of these changes. So I want to invite you into this movement to create happier, healthier places. And this has been just a taste of this movement. But I want to remind you, in all our work in design, in urban planning, in creating urban systems and city spaces, we have a choice. We can push people apart or we can draw them together. And if we choose to draw people together in places that are comfortable and joyful and welcoming, we can build a society that is more trusting, a society of care, a society of empathy, which is exactly the society we need if we're going to tackle the great challenges of our age. We need to be societies of trust and of care. We need to be social societies. And I would say we also need to be happier societies. And design can help us get there. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to your questions.
Потрясающе. A striking presentation. Amazed. And again, honestly, we'd like to invite you straight to Moscow to show you the very recent developments in Moscow, what changes we have seen even in this pandemic year. A great number of cycling roads have been built so that that myth should be destroyed. I myself take bicycle to my office, and it took some effort to do that, and it's about 10 kilometers. It's quite a way, and I'm happy doing that. So I would like to ask you, who should initiate the change? The citizens or the authorities? The city authorities? Who should initiate that? Grassroots are the tops. We don't have a happiness expert here in this panel, or even within the country. So in your opinion, who should initialize that?
Thank you for the question, and I'm so glad that you are cycling to work now. I share your happiness on this. You ask, who should be leading the change? The simple answer is everyone. It is all our jobs. So obviously, the politicians and the city planners who are leading policy and deciding expenditures must lead. At the same time, citizens must participate. Now, I am not familiar with the participatory culture in Russia, but here in Canada, we encourage citizens to go out in the middle of the night with a can of paint and reclaim their streets. Because when they do, they shame the local government into acting, and often the local government will follow up and make those changes permanent. There's one other group who are responsible for building happiness, and that is property developers. They have tremendous power to be shaping lives by shaping places. And it's been my experience that people in the property development industry really care about the lives of people who will live in the places they create. And I invite them to join this journey. And we're here to help.
Do I get it right that it is not actually important what is the current political system of this or that big city? Let's say we don't care is it a developed democracy or a hard authoritarian regime like in North Korea. But the city planner can actually provide for a city for any person to feel happy, regardless of the regime prevailing in that particular country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say this, what we are learning increasingly through our work, because we consider ourselves to be experts, and we believe it's important to follow the evidence, but we've learned a new lesson in the past few years, which is that, yes, we're the experts, but the real experts of the city are the people who live there. And the more that local authorities can bring the residents of the city into the process, can work with residents first to educate them about the design and well-being connection, but then to invite them into processes so we can co-imagine the future of the city together. To me, this produces the best results.
So then basically we're talking about a democratic or liberal system, a system that allows for both city planners and citizens trusting each other and communicating directly. Again, what are the limitations? What are the other limitations for planning a happy city here in Russia that you have noticed?
So we think a great deal about habits because here in Canada and in North America generally, one of the reasons we plan bad places is because we developed very bad habits. Those habits now exist in our laws and our practices. I think bad habits can be fixed into place in any country and in any system. So I would think the question for Russians is, which of our planning habits are bad? Now, all of us developed a bad habit over the past 70 years. We decided that we needed to plan for the movement of automobiles as opposed to the movement of people. It's a difficult habit to change because the habit becomes built into your engineering and your street standards. So I would say changing those bad habits in any country, whether it's Russia or Canada, is crucial. And to me, that seems like a block. And I would also say one more thing. I think in Russia, you could be more open to experimentation. So everywhere we work, we see that governments find one model and they pursue one model, when in fact what we need is complexity. We need 1,000 models. And this is why I was so excited to find the work of Studio Strelka.
Okay, in your opinion, what are the 3 most happy cities in the world? And don't mention Vancouver, please.
Okay, ready? This will be called my idiosyncratic list. I'm going to say Copenhagen is at the top of the list for the way they value the freedom of everyone to move. I'm going to say Mexico City, because Mexico City breaks all the rules, and yet through its chaos, they've infused life into every city block. Life is happening. And the city is being redesigned to accommodate poorer people and help them move more easily. I'm also going to throw to you Melbourne, Australia, for the way they have rediscovered the power of small social spaces using what we call back alleys or side streets to become more social streets, to become wonderful places for people to gather. And there are dozens of others. I think there is a little bit of happy city in every city in the world, to be honest.
Thank you so much. And let it be the last question, even though it's an important one. Well, we talk a lot, and most of your presentation, whatever we heard, a correct way to move towards a happy city. But in 2020, we faced a new reality. So it's impossible, if we revert to the first 2 original pictures, you know, a still full of pedestrians, mask-free. Nobody's wearing masks, very good. You have this pleasant chaos. Times have changed. Is it possible to minimize the stress of the citizens and try to maintain a higher level of happiness in these pandemic times? If yes, what are the recipes, if you could?
I'll try not to cry. We're in a lockdown in my city. We miss each other, and it's a sad time. But I will say a couple of things are effective. Number one, we cannot stop socializing, but we have to do it safely. What that means then is that we have to see each other outside, and we need so much more space to do it. If you do not have parks in your neighborhoods, then you need to take the streets, create safe spaces for people to gather at a distance from each other. And we need to infuse all of our city spaces with as much nature as we can. And there's one more piece. I think it's something that we all need to remember right now. And this is advice I heard from our chief medical health officer in British Columbia, in my province. And her advice is very simple. It's within all of us to be calm, to be kind, and to be safe, but to never stop being kind to one another and to see the goodness in one another, even while we're at distance.
It was very impressive. Thank you so much.
Great.
Спасибо большое. Это был headliner,
Thank you so much.
10
That was the
декабря
headliner,
Московский урбанистический
December
форум.
10,
Мы уезжаем прямо из
Moscow
центра
Urban
столицы.
Forum.
А с
We're
вами
now
был
sitting
Чарльз
right
Монтгомери.
in the heart of
Я
Moscow,
Ksenia
and
Chudinova,
Charles
главный
Montgomery
редактор
was with us, and I'm
проекта
Ksenia
«СНОП».
Chudinova,
Не
editor-in-chief of the
переключайтесь,
SNOP
всё
project.
будет только
Stay with us.
интереснее.
It's
Спасибо,
getting to be
пока.
more interesting. Thank you and bye-bye.